The morning mist clung to the Mississippi River like the spirits of the drowned, and Patience Blackwood knew that death was coming to Magnolia Heights. She had felt it in her bones for 3 days now, ever since Moses drew his last rattling breath in the quarters, his back still bearing the fresh wounds from Crawford's whip. The knowing had settled deep in her chest, cold and certain as winter dawn. Standing before the great brick hearth in the plantation's kitchen house, Patience stirred the morning grits with steady hands that had not trembled in 25 years of bondage. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had learned to navigate the treacherous waters between survival and dignity. Her dark skin bore the faint scars of smallpox from childhood, and her hands showed the burns and cuts of decades spent commanding the domain of fire and blade that fed Magnolia Heights. But her eyes, those deep brown eyes that had seen too much, still held the sharp intelligence that made white folks uncomfortable when they caught her watching. "Patience, you best get them biscuits started," called Beulah from the pantry, her voice carrying the weariness of a woman who had risen before dawn for 60 years. "Master Beaumont got company coming for breakfast, and you know how he get when the bread ain't right." "Already got the dough rising," Patience replied, not turning from her stirring. The kitchen house buzzed with the familiar choreography of morning preparation. 3 women and 2 men moved through the space with practiced efficiency, their movements synchronized by years of working under Patience's watchful eye. As head cook, she orchestrated this daily performance with the precision of a conductor, knowing that a single missed note could bring Crawford's wrath down upon them all. The kitchen house stood separate from the main plantation house, connected by a covered walkway that allowed the White family to maintain the fiction that they were somehow removed from the labor that sustained their luxury. Built of brick and cypress, with wide windows to let out the heat and smoke, it was Patience's domain, the only place on Magnolia Heights where she held something approaching power. Master Aldrich Beaumont owned 300 souls and 2,000 acres of prime Mississippi Delta cotton land. He had inherited the plantation from his father, along with the assumption that the people who worked his fields were property to be managed like livestock. Patience had been 12 when she arrived at Magnolia Heights, sold from a failing plantation in Virginia along with her mother. That was 26 years ago, and she could still remember the weight of the chains around her ankles during the journey west. "Morning, Aunt Patience." The voice belonged to Samuel, 16 and still growing into his frame. He was not her blood nephew, but in the quarters, family extended beyond the bonds of birth to encompass all who shared the burden of bondage. Samuel worked the gardens and helped in the kitchen when the workload demanded it. "Morning, child. You get them eggs collected yet?" "Yes, ma'am. 3 dozen from the henhouse, and I found 2 more nests the hens been hiding down by the creek." Patience nodded her approval. Samuel had learned well from Moses, who had taught him not just to tend the chickens and collect eggs, but to observe everything. Which hens laid well, which were broody, how to read the subtle signs that warned of hawk or fox. Moses had been the plantation's blacksmith for 40 years, and his knowledge extended far beyond the forge. He had been teacher, healer, and keeper of memories for the entire community of enslaved people at Magnolia Heights. Now Moses was dead. The thought struck Patience like a physical blow, as it had every few minutes since she had held his hand as he passed 3 nights ago. The old man had been beaten nearly to death for supposedly stealing a hammer that later turned up in Crawford's own toolshed. Dr. Ashford, the plantation physician who treated both the White family and their human property, had cleaned Moses's wounds with whiskey and pronounced him likely to recover. But infection had set in, and Moses had died in fever and delirium, calling out for his wife Sarah, who had been sold 20 years earlier. Patience had sat with him through his final night, along with Ruby, 15 years old and the daughter of Patience's dearest friend, Esther, who had died giving birth to her. Moses had raised Ruby after Esther's death, teaching her letters and numbers in secret, filling her mind with stories of Africa and freedom. Now Ruby would have to face the world without his protection. "Miss Patience, you need me to start the fires under the washpots?" This from young Gabriel, who worked in the stables and helped around the kitchen house. At 17, he was tall and strong, with clever hands and eyes that missed nothing. Patience had been watching him, seeing the restlessness that came to young men who began to understand that their strength and intelligence would never belong to themselves. "Not yet, Gabriel. Master got company coming, so we gonna need all hands for breakfast preparation first. The company was Judge Clement Whitmore and his wife, who were staying at Magnolia Heights for a week while the judge heard cases in Natchez. Judge Whitmore was known throughout Mississippi for his harsh sentences against enslaved people who dared to resist their bondage. He had sentenced men to death for striking an overseer, women to brutal whippings for running away, and children to sail away from their parents for the crime of learning to read. Patience had served him breakfast for 6 mornings now, watching him cut his ham with the same steady hand he used to sign death warrants. She had listened to him discuss his judicial philosophy with Master Beaumont over coffee and biscuits, explaining how harsh punishment was the only thing that kept the enslaved population from rising up against their natural superiors. The nigger must be kept in his place through fear, Judge Whitmore had said just yesterday, dabbing his lips with a napkin that Patience had embroidered during the long winter evenings. Mercy is mistaken for weakness by the colored mind. They respect only strength and punishment. Master Beaumont had nodded agreement, never looking at Patience as she refilled his coffee cup, as if she were no more sentient than the furniture. As the morning progressed, Patience moved through her tasks with mechanical precision while her mind worked at the problem that had been consuming her for days. Ruby was to be sold next week. Master Beaumont had debts from his cotton speculation that had gone bad, and he needed ready cash. The girl would bring $800 at auction, a fine price for a young, healthy house servant who could read and write. Patience had raised Ruby since Esther's death, teaching her alongside her own twin sons, Marcus and Isaiah, until they had been sold south to the sugar plantations when they turned 16. That was 4 years ago, and Patience had not heard from them since. Every morning she woke with their names on her lips, every night she fell asleep wondering if they were still alive. Now they would take Ruby too. The girl didn't know yet. Master Beaumont would announce it after Judge Whitmore departed, presenting it as a generous opportunity for Ruby to serve in a fine house in New Orleans. But Patience knew the truth, that Ruby would disappear into the vast machinery of slavery, her quick mind and gentle spirit broken on the wheel of someone else's profit. Unless Patience acted first. The knowledge had been growing in her for months, ever since the conjure woman had passed through the quarters the previous winter. Old Minerva had arrived during a February snow, claiming to be looking for work as a seamstress but staying long enough to share remedies and wisdom with the women of Magnolia Heights. She had shown them which plants could ease childbirth pain, which could prevent conception, and which could bring a peaceful death to those who had suffered enough. Oleander, she had whispered to Patience during their private conversation in the darkness of the smokehouse. Pretty pink flowers that bloom in the late summer heat. The sap, the leaves, the bark, all of it carries death. Just a little bit mixed into food or drink, and a person will sleep the long sleep. But you got to be careful, too much too fast, and it brings convulsions and screaming. Better to use just enough to make the heart stop quiet like. Patience had listened carefully, committing every word to memory. At the time, she had thought the knowledge might be useful if her pain ever became unbearable. Now she understood that Providence had sent old Minerva to prepare her for this moment. The oleander bushes grew wild along the river, their pink blossoms as beautiful as they were deadly. 2 days ago, while gathering wild greens for the kitchen, Patience had collected a basket full of leaves and flowers. They now lay drying in the space beneath her cabin floor, waiting for the harvest moon that would rise in 4 nights. Master Beaumont was planning his annual harvest moon celebration for Saturday night, a grand feast to celebrate the successful cotton harvest and to show off his wealth to the other planters in the county. 30 families were expected, including some of the richest men in Mississippi. The state senator would attend, along with 3 circuit judges, 2 bank presidents, and a dozen plantation owners who controlled thousands of enslaved lives between them. Patience would prepare the feast, as she had for 12 years running. She would oversee every dish, taste every sauce, and personally serve the spiced wine punch that was the traditional centerpiece of the celebration. The punch was her own recipe, a complex mixture of peach brandy, Madeira wine, lemon juice, and exotic spices that had made her famous throughout Natchez society. The ladies always complimented Master Beaumont on his cook's special punch, never imagining that the recipe had come from Patience's mother, who had learned it from her grandmother in Virginia. This year, The punch would carry an additional ingredient. Patience ladled grits into a serving bowl and called for Samuel to carry it to the dining room. The morning meal was ready: ham steaks glazed with molasses, eggs beaten with cream, fresh biscuits with butter and honey, and grits cooked to the perfect consistency that Master Beaumont demanded. She had prepared this same breakfast hundreds of times, but today it felt different. Today, she was counting down to Saturday night. As she watched Samuel carry the food into the main house, Patience allowed herself to think about what lay beyond Saturday. There would be no escape for her. She had no illusions about that. When the white folks started dying, they would know immediately who had poisoned them. The head cook was always the first suspect in such cases, and Patience had no intention of claiming innocence. She would die for what she was planning to do, but she would die on her own terms. But Ruby would be gone by then. And Gabriel too, if he was smart enough to take the opportunity she would create for him. Patience had been making quiet arrangements, calling in favors owed by free people of color in Natchez under the Hill, the rough river district where runaway enslaved people could sometimes find passage north. She had gold coins hidden beneath her cabin floor, money saved from the tips that plantation guests sometimes gave to exceptional servants, payment for small favors done for white ladies who needed a skilled seamstress or herbalist. It would be enough to buy Ruby and Gabriel passage on a riverboat heading north, with forged papers identifying them as free people of color traveling to visit relatives in Cincinnati. The Ohio River marked the boundary between bondage and freedom, and if they could reach it, they might have a chance at the life that had been denied to Patience and her sons. The morning passed in the usual rhythm of kitchen work. Patience supervised the preparation of preserves and pickles, directed the cleaning of copper pots, and planned the elaborate menu for Saturday night's feast. To the casual observer, she appeared no different than any other day, efficient, watchful, completely absorbed in her duties as head cook. But beneath the surface, her mind was calculating portions and timing, estimating how much oleander extract would be needed for 30 guests, determining which dishes would best mask the bitter taste of the poison. She thought about Moses, lying cold in his grave beside the quarters, and about Marcus and Isaiah, sold away to lives of unimaginable brutality. She thought about Ruby, whose bright spirit would be crushed in some stranger's kitchen, and about all the others who had been born, lived, and died as property. Saturday night would be different. For once in her life, Patience Blackwood would decide who lived and who died. The October sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the vast cotton fields that stretched to the horizon. The harvest was nearly complete, and the enslaved workers moved through the rows like ants, their bent backs and quick hands gathering the white gold that built fortunes for men like Aldrich Beaumont. Soon they would return to the quarters, exhausted and aching, to rest their bodies for another day of endless labor. But not for much longer. Change was coming to Magnolia Heights, carried in the hands of a woman who had learned to hide her true thoughts behind a mask of servitude. Patience stirred the dinner soup and smiled for the first time in days. The harvest moon would bring more than celebration. It would bring justice, delivered by the only hands that could serve it. The afternoons belonged to preparation, and Patience used them to perfect her plans with the same meticulous attention she brought to seasoning a sauce or timing a roast. While the other kitchen workers cleaned up from the noon meal and prepared for supper, she walked the grounds of Magnolia Heights, ostensibly gathering herbs and checking on the fall garden, but actually mapping every detail of Saturday night's logistics. The great house stood at the center of the plantation like a white temple to wealth and power. Built in the Greek Revival style that proclaimed its owner's classical education and refined taste, it rose 2 full stories above a raised basement, with massive columns supporting a second-floor gallery that wrapped around 3 sides. Master Beaumont's grandfather had designed it to impress visitors with its grandeur, and successive generations had added furnishings and decorations that spoke of European travel and expensive tastes. Patience knew every room in that house, every hidden stair and servant's passage. She had cleaned its floors, polished its furniture, and served meals in its elegant dining spaces for over 2 decades. She understood its rhythms as intimately as she understood the breathing of a sleeping child. The formal dining room could seat 24 comfortably, but for the harvest moon celebration, Master Beaumont would open the connecting parlor and arrange tables to accommodate all 30 guests. The evening would begin with cocktails on the front gallery, move inside for the elaborate dinner, and conclude with dancing in the ballroom while the men retired to the library for cigars and brandy. Patience's punch would be served throughout the evening, refilled from the large crystal bowl that had belonged to Master Beaumont's grandmother. The bowl sat on a marble-topped sideboard in the main parlor, positioned where guests could serve themselves throughout the night. It was the perfect delivery system for what she had planned. But the punch would not be her only weapon. Patience had been studying the guest list that Master Beaumont's wife had given her, identifying specific individuals who deserved special attention. Head Overseer Crawford would be there, of course, along with his wife Martha, who took particular pleasure in having enslaved women whipped for imagined infractions. Judge Whitmore and his cold wife would attend, as would Dr. Ashford, who had been known to use enslaved people as subjects for his medical experiments. These four would receive carefully prepared individual portions, dishes that only they would eat, carrying doses of oleander extract calculated to ensure they never left Magnolia Heights alive. The others would share the contaminated punch, receiving smaller amounts that would sicken some and kill others, depending on their constitution and how much they consumed. Patience had tested small amounts of the oleander extract on rats she trapped in the smokehouse, carefully measuring the relationship between dosage and effect. Too little, and the poison would cause only stomach upset. Too much, and the victims would die too quickly, allowing Dr. Ashford time to identify the cause and potentially save some lives. She needed the deaths to appear like a sudden epidemic, food poisoning that struck an unlucky gathering, tragic but not immediately suspicious. "Miss Patience, you find what you're looking for?" She turned to see Gabriel approaching through the kitchen garden, carrying a basket of late tomatoes and peppers. The boy moved with the easy grace of youth, but Patience could see the tension in his shoulders, the watchfulness in his dark eyes that marked a young man beginning to understand his position in the world. "Just checking on the herbs," she replied, pulling a handful of sage from her apron pocket. Master Beaumont's guests expect everything to be perfect for Saturday night. Gabriel nodded, but something in his expression suggested he sensed deeper currents. He was intelligent, this boy, too intelligent for his own safety if he wasn't careful. Patience had been watching him for months, seeing the questions in his eyes when he observed the casual cruelties of plantation life, the way his hands clenched when Crawford barked orders or struck someone for moving too slowly. "Gabriel," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone, "you ever think about what lies north of here?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Gabriel's eyes sharpened, and he looked at her with new attention. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Moses used to tell stories about places where colored folk could work for wages, send their children to school." Moses. The mention of the old blacksmith's name sent a familiar stab of grief through Patience's chest. Moses had been more than a skilled craftsman. He had been the unofficial leader of the quarters, the man people turned to for advice and comfort. He had baptized babies in the creek, married young couples with words and rituals that gave their unions dignity despite their legal meaninglessness, and sat with the dying to ensure no one passed alone. Crawford had killed him over a missing hammer, but the real crime had been Moses's refusal to be broken. After 40 years of bondage, he had maintained his dignity, his sense of justice, and his belief that all people deserved freedom. That unbreakable spirit had been more dangerous to the plantation system than any physical rebellion. "Moses told true stories," Patience said. "There are places where colored folk can be free. But getting there—" She left the sentence unfinished, allowing Gabriel to draw his own conclusions. They walked back toward the kitchen house in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Patience was calculating how much money she would need to secure Gabriel's passage north, while Gabriel was wondering if this conversation meant what he hoped it meant. The kitchen house buzzed with afternoon activity. Beulah was directing Samuel in the preparation of vegetables for supper, while Jenny, a young woman recently brought in from field work to help with cooking, learned to properly clean fish under the sharp eye of Thomas, who had been working in the kitchen for 15 years. Patience surveyed her domain with satisfaction. These people had become her family over the years, bound together by shared hardship and mutual dependence. She had trained most of them, protected them from Crawford's worst impulses, and help them navigate the dangerous waters of plantation life. Now she was planning to leave them, and the weight of that decision pressed on her heart like a physical burden. But some sacrifices were necessary to strike a meaningful blow against the system that had destroyed so many lives. Patience had learned long ago that individual survival was not enough. Sometimes you had to risk everything to create opportunities for others. She thought of her sons, Marcus and Isaiah, sold away to the sugar plantations of Louisiana when they reached an age where their strength could command high prices. The twins had been bright boys, quick to learn and eager to help in the kitchen when their field work was finished. Patience had taught them to read using a Bible stolen from the main house, showing them letters by candlelight in the secrecy of her cabin. When Master Beaumont announced their sale, Patience had begged him to reconsider, offering to work extra hours, to take on additional responsibilities, to do anything to keep her children close. But the cotton market had been poor that year, and Beaumont needed cash to pay his debts. The boys brought $800 each at auction, more than enough to solve his immediate financial problems. Patience had not been allowed to say goodbye. She had been locked in the smokehouse the night before their departure to prevent any hysterical scenes that might disturb the White family's sleep. By morning, Marcus and Isaiah were gone, loaded into a wagon with 5 other young men bound for New Orleans and the brutal sugar harvest that killed more enslaved people than any other form of agricultural labor. That had been 4 years ago, and not a day passed without Patience wondering if her sons were still alive. She had tried to get word through the network of free people of color who moved between plantations, but news from the sugar country was rare and usually bad. Most young men sent there died within 5 years, worked to death in the grinding mills or succumbing to the yellow fever that swept through the Louisiana swamps each summer. Now they planned to take Ruby, the girl who had become like a daughter to Patience since Esther's death. But this time would be different. This time, Patience would ensure that the system paid a price for its cruelty. "Miss Patience, you want me to start preparing the duck for tomorrow night?" Jenny's voice interrupted her brooding thoughts. "Yes, child. And make sure you save all the fat. We gonna need it for the potatoes." The Harvest Moon feast would feature roasted ducks, venison, ham, fish, oysters, vegetables, breads, and desserts, a display of abundance designed to showcase Master Beaumont's wealth and generosity. Patience had been perfecting the menu for weeks, balancing flavors and textures, timing the preparation so that every dish would be perfect when served. It would be her masterpiece in more ways than one. As evening approached, Patience walked down to the quarters to visit Ruby. The girl lived in a small cabin with 2 other young women who worked in the house, but Patience had arranged for her to have some privacy by sending the others on errands. Ruby was sitting by the window, mending a tear in one of Mrs. Beaumont's petticoats with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. At 15, she had grown into a lovely young woman with her mother's gentle features and intelligent eyes. She had inherited Esther's skill with a needle and Moses's quick mind for learning, making her valuable as both seamstress and house servant. Too valuable for Master Beaumont to keep when he needed ready cash. "Good evening, Aunt Patience," Ruby said, looking up from her sewing. "You've been working hard today, I can see it in your face." "Every day is hard work, child. But some days carry more weight than others." Patience sat beside Ruby on the rough wooden bench that served as furniture in the cabin. The space was sparse but clean, with personal touches that spoke of the occupant's humanity. A quilt pieced from fabric scraps, dried flowers hanging from the rafters, a wooden cross carved by Moses's skilled hands. "Ruby," Patience began, choosing her words carefully, "if you could go anywhere in the world, where would you choose?" The girl looked puzzled by the question. "I never really thought about it, Aunt Patience. This is all I ever known." "But if you could," Patience pressed, "if you were free to choose your own path, what would you want?" Ruby set down her sewing and considered the question seriously. "I suppose I would want to live somewhere I could use the letters Moses taught me. Maybe teach other colored children to read and write. He always said education was the key to freedom." "Moses was a wise man," Patience agreed, "and he would want you to have that chance." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the quarters. Through the thin cabin walls, they could hear the sounds of evening, children playing, women cooking supper over open fires, men returning from the fields with aching backs and empty stomachs. It was the sound of a community making the best of impossible circumstances, finding moments of joy and connection despite the brutality of their situation. Patience thought about all the evenings she had sat like this with her own sons, teaching them letters and numbers, sharing stories of freedom and justice that seemed like fairy tales in the context of plantation life. She had failed to protect Marcus and Isaiah, but perhaps she could still save Ruby. "Child," she said finally, "I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say, and I need you to trust me completely." Ruby turned to look at her, sensing the seriousness in Patience's tone. "Yes, ma'am. I'm listening. Saturday night, during the Harvest Moon celebration, I want you to pack a small bag with only essential items. Nothing that would be missed if you disappeared. Can you do that without attracting attention?" The girl's eyes widened, but she nodded. "Yes, ma'am. But why?" "Don't ask questions," Patience interrupted. "Just trust me. And tell Gabriel that I want to speak with him tomorrow after supper. Tell him to meet me by the old oak tree down by the creek." Ruby's hands trembled slightly as she picked up her sewing again. "Aunt Patience, are we gonna run away?" "Not we, child. And if the good Lord is willing, you gonna make it to freedom." The words hung in the air like a promise and a prayer. Ruby stared at Patience with a mixture of hope and fear, understanding that her world was about to change in ways she could not yet comprehend. Patience rose from the bench and placed a gentle hand on Ruby's head. "Don't speak of this to anyone, you hear me? And don't do anything different from your normal routine. Just be ready when the time comes." As she walked back toward the main house through the gathering darkness, Patience felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. In 3 days, she would set in motion events that could not be undone. Some people would die, others would suffer, and the reverberations would be felt throughout the county. But Ruby would be free. And perhaps, in some small way, justice would be served for Moses, for Marcus and Isaiah, for Esther, and for all the others who had lived and died as property. The harvest moon was waxing toward full, and with it came the promise of reckoning. Patience Blackwood had lived as a slave for 26 years, but she would die as something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and the knowledge to make her enemies pay. Thursday morning brought the first frost to Magnolia Heights, silver crystals coating the kitchen garden and painting the world in delicate lace. Patience stood at the window of the kitchen house, watching the sun burn away the night's icy blessing while her hands worked automatically at kneading bread dough. The cold meant winter was approaching, but she would not live to see it. That knowledge brought her a strange peace, like the acceptance that comes after a long and difficult decision has finally been made. She had 2 days left. The kitchen bustled with preparation for the evening meal and the elaborate requirements of Saturday night's feast. Thomas was breaking down chickens for fricassee, his knife working with the practiced efficiency of decades. Beulah supervised Jenny in the proper technique for clarifying consommé, while Samuel ground spices with a mortar and pestle, filling the air with the warm scents of cinnamon, nutmeg, and mace. To any observer, Patience appeared completely absorbed in the ordinary tasks of kitchen management. But beneath the surface, her mind was focused on deadlier preparations. The oleander extract was ready, distilled from the leaves and flowers she had collected and processed over the past 3 days. It sat now in a small vial hidden beneath the floorboards of her cabin, concentrated enough that a few drops could stop a human heart. She had tested the final product on a rat the previous evening, watching as the creature succumbed within minutes to convulsions followed by stillness. The dose had been carefully calculated, enough to ensure effectiveness, not so much as to cause immediate suspicion when the human victims began to fall. "Miss Patience, Master Beaumont want to see you in the library." The voice belonged to Lucy, one of the house servants who cleaned the main residence and served at family meals. She was young, perhaps 18, with the nervous energy of someone who had not yet learned to hide her thoughts behind an impenetrable mask. Patience wiped her hands on her apron and followed Lucy through the covered walkway that connected the kitchen house to the main residence. The library was Master Beaumont's private domain, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that proclaimed his education and refinement. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, reviewing papers with the concentrated attention he brought to matters of profit and loss. Aldrich Beaumont was 45 years old, with the soft features and pale complexion of a man who had never performed physical labor. His brown hair was thinning at the crown, and his waistcoat strained slightly over a belly that spoke of rich food and little exercise. But his gray eyes were sharp and calculating, missing nothing that might affect his financial interests. "Patience," he said without looking up from his papers. "I trust preparations for Saturday evening are proceeding satisfactorily?" "Yes, Master Beaumont. Everything will be ready as planned." "Good. Judge Whitmore has been most complimentary about your cooking during his stay. He particularly enjoyed the turtle soup you prepared Tuesday evening." Patience inclined her head slightly, accepting the compliment without expression. Judge Whitmore would have different opinions about her cooking after Saturday night, assuming he lived long enough to form them. "I have invited additional guests," Beaumont continued, finally looking up at her. "State Senator Hartwell will be attending with his wife, along with Mr. Davidson from the Planters Bank and his family. That brings our total to 34 rather than 30. The change in numbers would require adjustments to her planning, but Patience had expected such modifications. White folks were notorious for treating servants' time as infinitely expandable, never considering the additional work created by their casual changes. "I'll adjust the preparations accordingly, Master." "See that you do. This gathering is important for my business relationships. Several of the gentlemen are considering investments in railroad development, and I intend to convince them that Mississippi offers superior opportunities to Alabama or Georgia." Patience listened with half her attention while calculating how the additional guests would affect her poison distribution. 4 more people meant adjusting the punch recipe to ensure adequate potency while spreading the oleander extract across a larger group. It also meant identifying the newcomers and determining whether they deserved to be included among her primary targets. "There is another matter," Beaumont said, his tone shifting slightly. "I have received an excellent offer for Ruby. Mr. Thornton from New Orleans visited yesterday and was quite impressed with her skills as a seamstress. He is prepared to pay $900 for immediate delivery." The words hit Patience like a physical blow, but she kept her expression neutral through decades of practice in hiding her reactions from white eyes. $900 was an exceptional price for a 15-year-old girl, suggesting that Mr. Thornton had purposes in mind beyond sewing. "When will she leave, Master?" "Tomorrow morning. Thornton is returning to New Orleans on the afternoon packet, and he wants Ruby ready to accompany him. You will inform her of this honor after supper tonight." The word tasted like poison in Patience's mouth, but she merely nodded acknowledgement. Tomorrow morning would be too late for her plan to save Ruby through the Harvest Moon chaos. She would have to move faster than anticipated. "Will there be anything else, Master Beaumont?" "No, that will be all. Ensure that Ruby understands the privilege being accorded to her. Not every colored girl receives the opportunity to serve in such a fine household." Patience left the library with her mind racing through revised possibilities. Ruby's departure had been moved up by 2 days, destroying the careful timeline she had constructed. But perhaps this change could work in her favor. If Ruby disappeared the night before she was supposed to leave for New Orleans, the search would focus on finding a runaway rather than investigating any connection to Saturday night's festivities. She found Gabriel in the stables, rubbing down Master Beaumont's mare with practiced strokes that left the animal's coat gleaming. At 17, he had grown into his height and strength, with the kind of quiet competence that made him valuable as a stableman but dangerous as a potential rebel. "Gabriel," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone, "I need you to listen carefully." The boy looked up from his work, reading the urgency in her expression. "Yes, ma'am." "Can you be ready to travel tonight? With nothing but what you can carry in a small bag." Gabriel's hands stilled on the brush, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, ma'am. If that's what you need." "It is. Ruby too. We don't have until Saturday anymore." She explained the situation in quick, quiet words, watching Gabriel's face as he absorbed the implications. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Aunt Patience," he said finally, "what about you? Don't worry about me, child. I got my own path to follow." Gabriel nodded slowly, understanding more than he spoke. "What do you need me to do?" "Meet me at midnight by the old oak down by the creek. Bring Ruby with you, and make sure nobody sees you leaving the quarters. Can you manage that?" "Yes, ma'am. We'll be there." Patience spent the rest of the day making final preparations while maintaining the appearance of normal kitchen routine. She retrieved her hidden cache of gold coins, $23 saved over years of tips and small payments for special services to white ladies who needed remedies or complicated sewing. It was enough to buy passage north for 2 young people with forged papers, especially if they were willing to work their way up the river. As evening approached, she made her way to the quarters to inform Ruby of Master Beaumont's decision. The girl received the news with remarkable composure, though Patience could see the fear flickering in her eyes. "New Orleans," Ruby said quietly. "Moses always said that was a hard place for colored folk." "Moses spoke truth about many things," Patience replied. "But you won't be going to New Orleans, child. Not if I can help it." She explained the revised plan in whispered words, watching Ruby's expression shift from despair to cautious hope. The girl was intelligent enough to understand the risks, but young enough to believe in the possibility of escape. "What about you, Aunt Patience? Won't you come with us?" "My place is here, child. I got business to finish before I can rest." Ruby seemed to understand that some questions should not be asked. She embraced Patience fiercely, holding on as if physical contact could somehow protect them both from the dangers that lay ahead. Patience returned to her cabin as full darkness settled over the plantation. She lit a single candle and retrieved the vial of oleander extract from its hiding place beneath the floorboards. The liquid was clear and odorless, betraying nothing of its lethal nature. She held it up to the candlelight, watching the poison catch and reflect the flame like liquid death. Tomorrow night, this innocent-looking fluid would bring justice to Magnolia Heights. But tonight, it would serve a different purpose, ensuring Ruby and Gabriel's escape by creating a distraction that would occupy every white person on the plantation. Patience divided the extract into 2 portions. The larger amount went back into hiding, reserved for Saturday's feast. The smaller portion, just enough to incapacitate without killing, she poured into a second vial that she tucked into her apron pocket along with the gold coins and forged papers she had obtained through her network of contacts in Natchez under the hill. The papers identified Ruby as Rose Freeman, a free woman of color traveling to visit relatives in Cincinnati, and Gabriel as her brother George Freeman, employed as a riverboat porter. The documents had cost her $10 and were skillfully forged, but they would only stand up to casual inspection. If the authorities subjected them to serious scrutiny, the deception would be discovered, which meant Ruby and Gabriel had to disappear completely, leaving no trail for pursuit to follow. At 11:30, Patience made her way silently through the quarters toward the creek. The night was moonless and cold, with a wind that carried the scent of distant rain. Most of the cabins showed no light. The enslaved workers rose before dawn and needed every moment of rest they could steal. But she moved carefully anyway, knowing that Crawford sometimes patrolled the quarters at night, looking for infractions to punish. The old oak tree stood beside the creek like a sentinel, its massive trunk scarred by lightning and its branches spreading wide enough to shelter a small building. Moses had carved initials into that bark 20 years ago, his own and Sarah's, intertwined in a heart that remained visible despite the passage of time. Now he lay buried in the small cemetery beyond the quarters, while Sarah had long since disappeared into the vast network of slavery that scattered families like leaves in a storm. Ruby and Gabriel were waiting in the shadows, each carrying a small bundle that contained their few precious possessions. Ruby had brought her sewing supplies and the Bible that Moses had given her. Gabriel carried a knife, a change of clothing, and a carved wooden horse that had belonged to his father. "You both understand what you must do?" Patience whispered, pressing the papers and most of her gold into Gabriel's hands. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "We follow the creek to the river, find Captain Morrison on the Mississippi Belle, and give him the message you told us." Captain Morrison was a white man who ran passengers and cargo between Natchez and Cincinnati, but he was also known to help runaway slaves for the right price. Patience had done business with him before, providing information about plantation security and safe houses in exchange for news of the outside world. "Remember," she continued, "you are free people of color traveling to visit family. Act like you belong wherever you are, and don't volunteer information to anyone who doesn't need to know it. If someone challenges your papers, be polite but confident. Fear makes people suspicious." Ruby nodded solemnly, clutching her small bundle against her chest. "Aunt Patience, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet, child. Thank me when you're safe in Cincinnati and learning to read and write with free colored children." Patience embraced both young people, holding them close for a moment that felt like goodbye and prayer and blessing all together. Then she stepped back, becoming once again the practical woman who solved problems through careful planning and decisive action. "Go now," she said, "and don't look back." She watched them disappear into the darkness, 2 young lives carrying hope toward an uncertain future. If they were caught, they would face punishments that would make death seem merciful. But if they succeeded, they would prove that the system that claimed to own them was not as unbreakable as it pretended to be. Patience made her way back toward the main house, but instead of returning to her cabin, she detoured to the kitchen house. Using her master key, a privilege that came with her position as head cook, she entered the silent workspace and moved to the large pantry where foodstuffs for the next day's meals were stored. The evening meal for the White family had been prepared and served hours earlier, but the remains of soup, bread, and cold meats sat covered on the work tables, awaiting distribution to the servants or storage in the larder. Patience found what she was looking for, a small bowl of custard that had been prepared for Mrs. Beaumont, who preferred light sweets before retiring. She added 3 drops of oleander extract to the custard, stirring carefully to distribute the poison throughout the creamy dessert. The dose was calculated to cause severe illness without immediate death, enough to create a medical emergency that would require Dr. Ashford's attention and keep the White folks occupied while Ruby and Gabriel made their escape. Mrs. Beaumont typically ate her evening custard around 10 o'clock, which meant she would begin feeling ill sometime around midnight. By morning, the symptoms would be severe enough to cause panic but not fatal enough to kill her before Patience could complete her larger plan on Saturday night. Patience covered the bowl and returned it to its place, then made her way back to her cabin. She had done everything she could to ensure Ruby and Gabriel's escape. Now she had to wait and see whether her calculations had been correct. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of her sons working in the Louisiana sugar fields, their backs bent under the weight of cane stalks while overseers with whips ensured they maintained the killing pace that made fortunes for men who had never touched a tool. She woke several times, listening for sounds that might indicate Ruby and Gabriel had been discovered, but the night remained quiet except for the normal stirrings of a plantation at rest. Dawn brought the first test of her plan. Lucy came running to the kitchen house at 6:30, her face pale with fear. "Miss Patience, come quick. Mrs. Beaumont taken terrible sick in the night." Patience followed Lucy to the main house, her expression carefully arranged to show concern but no surprise. Mrs. Beaumont lay in her canopied bed, pale and sweating, while Dr. Ashford took her pulse with professional gravity. Master Beaumont paced the room like a caged animal, alternately demanding answers and threatening to sue someone for malpractice. "It appears to be some form of food poisoning," Dr. Ashford was saying. "Severe gastric distress, elevated pulse, and intermittent delirium. Has she eaten anything unusual in the past day?" "Nothing different from our normal meals," Beaumont replied. Patience prepared everything according to her usual standards. All eyes turned to Patience, who maintained an expression of puzzled concern. "I prepared custard for Mrs. Beaumont last evening, same as always. Used fresh eggs from our own chickens, cream from our own cows. Nothing different from what she's had 100 times before." Dr. Ashford nodded thoughtfully. Food poisoning can be unpredictable. Sometimes the same ingredients that have been safe for years can suddenly harbor dangerous bacteria, especially in warm weather. The discussion continued for several minutes while Patience stood quietly in the corner, appearing every inch the concerned servant whose mistress had fallen mysteriously ill. Inside, she was calculating timing and watching for signs that her distraction was working as planned. Master Beaumont was completely absorbed in his wife's condition, canceling his morning appointments and sending for a second physician from town. The household staff was in chaos, running back and forth with medications and cool cloths while trying to maintain normal operations. Crawford had been summoned to increase security around the main house, convinced that someone might have deliberately poisoned the mistress. No one noticed that Ruby was not in her usual place helping with breakfast service. No one thought to check whether Gabriel was tending the horses as he did every morning. The entire plantation was focused on the drama unfolding in the master bedroom, exactly as Patience had intended. By 10 o'clock, she was confident that Ruby and Gabriel had reached the river and were safely aboard the Mississippi Belle. The packet boat made its weekly run to Cincinnati on Friday mornings, and Captain Morrison would have been waiting for passengers who could pay premium prices for immediate departure. The irony was perfect. Master Beaumont's own gold, saved from tips given to his head cook, was now purchasing freedom for two young people he had considered his property. Ruby would never see New Orleans or experience the horrors that Mr. Thornton had planned for her. Gabriel would never break his back in another man's fields or endure another beating from Crawford's whip. They were free, and that freedom had been purchased with oleander extract and careful planning. But Patience's work was only half finished. Tomorrow night would bring the harvest moon, and with it, the reckoning that would make this small victory meaningful. Crawford, Dr. Ashford, Judge Whitmore, and Master Beaumont himself would answer for their crimes against humanity. She spent Friday in intensive preparation for the evening's feast, supervising every detail while maintaining the facade of a faithful servant concerned about her mistress's health. Mrs. Beaumont was recovering slowly, the carefully calculated dose of poison having achieved its purpose without causing permanent damage. As the sun set on Friday evening, Patience stood in her cabin holding the remaining vial of oleander extract. Tomorrow's full moon would illuminate the final chapter of her story, and she was ready to write it in the language of justice that her enemies would finally understand. Saturday dawned gray and cold, with clouds scudding across the October sky like harbingers of the storm that would break over Magnolia Heights before the night was through. Patience woke before sunrise, as she had every morning for 26 years, but this time the routine carried the weight of finality. She would never see another dawn. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone, heavy but not unwelcome. She had made her peace with death during the long nights of planning, understanding that some acts of justice required the ultimate sacrifice. Today she would poison the men who had destroyed so many lives, and tonight she would join Moses in whatever realm awaited those who died fighting against oppression. But first, she had a feast to prepare. The kitchen house buzzed with frantic energy as the remaining staff worked to complete preparations for the most elaborate meal of the year. Patience moved through the controlled chaos like a conductor orchestrating a complex symphony, tasting sauces, adjusting seasonings, and timing each dish so that the entire meal would reach perfection simultaneously. Thomas was roasting the ducks to golden brown perfection, their skin crackling with rendered fat that would be used to flavor the autumn vegetables. Beulah supervised the preparation of syllabub and other delicate desserts, while Samuel worked at grinding fresh spices for the special punch that would be the evening's centerpiece. Jenny had been pressed into service helping with final preparations, her nervous energy channeled into the repetitive tasks of chopping vegetables and stirring sauces. She was the newest member of the kitchen staff, brought in from field work when Patience requested additional help for the harvest season. Only Patience knew that Jenny was also the weak link in her plan, the person most likely to panic if something went wrong, the one whose reactions might give away the careful deception she had constructed. But there had been no choice. The scale of the evening's meal required every available hand, even inexperienced ones. "Miss Patience," Jenny called from across the kitchen, "this cream sauce looking a little thin. Should I add more flour?" "Just a pinch, child, and stir it in carefully. Don't want it getting lumpy." Patience moved to supervise the correction, but her attention was focused on the large crystal punch bowl that sat waiting on the marble-topped sideboard. The bowl had been polished to sparkling perfection, ready to hold the traditional harvest moon punch that had become her signature creation over the years. The recipe was complex, requiring precise measurements of peach brandy, Madeira wine, fresh lemon juice, and an exotic blend of spices that included cinnamon, nutmeg, mace, and cardamom. The mixture had to be stirred in a specific sequence and allowed to meld for exactly 30 minutes before serving, achieving the perfect balance of sweetness, acidity, and aromatic complexity that had made Patience famous throughout Natchez society. This year's batch would include one additional ingredient. As the afternoon progressed, Patience found herself moving between past and present, memory and immediate reality. She thought of her first harvest moon celebration at Magnolia Heights, when she had been a young woman learning her trade under the tutelage of old Martha, who had ruled the kitchen with iron discipline and encyclopedic knowledge of Southern cuisine. Martha had taught her that cooking was more than just following recipes. It was about understanding how ingredients combined and transformed, how heat and time could turn simple components into something greater than the sum of their parts. The old woman had also taught her that the kitchen was the one place on a plantation where an enslaved person could exercise genuine skill and creativity, where intelligence and artistry were valued even if they were never acknowledged. "A cook feeds people's bodies," Martha had said during one of their late-night conversations, "but a great cook feeds their souls. You learn to do that, child, and you'll have power they can't take away from you." Now Patience understood the deeper truth in those words. Tonight, she would use her skills to feed more than souls. She would serve a meal that would free them entirely. At 4 o'clock, she began the final preparations for the punch. Working alone in the pantry, she carefully measured each ingredient into the crystal bowl, adding the peach brandy first, then the Madeira wine, followed by the fresh squeezed lemon juice that would provide the acidic brightness that balanced the sweetness. The spices came next, ground to fine powder and whisked into the liquid until they were completely incorporated. She tasted the mixture, adjusting the balance with the expertise of decades, ensuring that every flavor was perfectly harmonized. Then she added the oleander extract. The poison went in drop by drop, 27 measured portions that would distribute death throughout the 34 guests expected for the evening. Patience had calculated the dosage carefully, enough to ensure that most of the men would die, not so much that the deaths would be immediate and obvious. Some of the ladies might survive, their smaller bodies requiring less poison to cause illness rather than death. Patience regretted this imprecision, but she had neither the knowledge nor the resources to target individuals more specifically through the communal punch bowl. The 4 men who had earned her special attention would receive more precise doses through individually prepared dishes. She had planned their deaths with the same careful attention she brought to seasoning a sauce, ensuring that Crawford, Dr. Ashford, Judge Whitmore, and Master Beaumont would not survive the night. As she stirred the contaminated punch with a long silver spoon, Patience allowed herself to think about Ruby and Gabriel. By now, they should be safely aboard the Mississippi Belle, well on their way to Cincinnati and freedom. The riverboat would have stopped at Vicksburg and Memphis, taking on cargo and passengers, but the young people would have remained in their cabin, posing as free people of color traveling to visit relatives. If all went according to plan, they would reach the Ohio River by Monday morning, crossing into free territory where no slave catchers could legally pursue them. Ruby would find work as a seamstress, using the skills Moses had taught her to support herself while she learned to read and write with the children of free black families. Gabriel would find employment on the riverboats or in one of Cincinnati's growing industries, earning wages that belonged to him alone. They would live the lives that had been denied to Patience's sons, to Moses, to Esther, and to countless others who had died in bondage. Their freedom would be Patience's gift to the future, purchased with the blood of their oppressors. At 6 o'clock, the first guests began arriving for cocktails on the front gallery. Patience could hear their voices through the kitchen house windows, the jovial greetings of men who had known each other for decades, the rustle of silk dresses as ladies complimented each other on their jewelry and hairstyles. These were the elite of Mississippi society, the people who controlled the economic and political systems that kept 3 million human beings in bondage. They owned banks and railroads, plantations and shipping companies, newspapers and churches. Their wealth was built on the unpaid labor of enslaved people, their power maintained through laws and customs that defined black people as property rather than human beings. Tonight, 34 of them had gathered to celebrate another successful harvest, another year of profits extracted from human suffering. They would drink toasts to their prosperity while the people who had created that wealth served them dinner and cleaned up their messes, invisible except when their services were required. But this harvest celebration would be different. This time, the servants would have the final word. Patience supervised the loading of silver trays with hors d'oeuvres and cocktails, watching as Thomas and Samuel carried the first offerings to the assembled guests. Everything had to be perfect. The appearance of normalcy was essential to her plan's success. At 7 o'clock, she personally carried the punch bowl to its place of honor on the parlor sideboard, setting it carefully among the crystal cups and silver ladles that would allow guests to serve themselves throughout the evening. Several ladies immediately approached to compliment her on the punch's appearance and aroma, praising Master Beaumont for having such a skilled cook. Patience has been perfecting this recipe for years, Beaumont told Judge Whitmore, ladling punch into crystal cups. I believe it's the finest harvest punch in all of Mississippi. Indeed, the judge replied, taking a sip and nodding approval. Complex flavors, perfectly balanced. Your cook is truly gifted, Beaumont. Patience accepted the compliments with downcast eyes and murmured thanks, playing the role of humble servant even as she watched the poison begin its work. The effects would not be immediate. Oleander took time to circulate through the bloodstream and reach the heart, but within an hour, some of the guests would begin feeling the first symptoms. She returned to the kitchen to oversee the final preparation of individual courses, paying special attention to the 4 dishes that would carry additional doses of poison. Crawford would receive oysters Rockefeller prepared with an extra measure of oleander extract mixed into the herb butter. Dr. Ashford's turtle soup would be seasoned with death. Judge Whitmore would enjoy quail stuffed with poison dressing. And Master Beaumont himself would dine on venison medallions glazed with a sauce that contained enough poison to stop an elephant's heart. At 8 o'clock, dinner was announced, and the guests moved into the dining room in a rustling procession of silk and broadcloth, diamonds and gold. Patience watched from the kitchen as they took their seats at tables laden with her culinary masterpieces, never suspecting that they were sitting down to their own funeral feast. The service proceeded flawlessly, each course appearing at precisely the right moment, every dish presented with the artistry that had made Patience famous throughout the region. The guests exclaimed over the complexity of flavors, the perfection of textures, the obvious skill required to coordinate such an elaborate meal. Thomas served Crawford's oysters with professional precision, the head overseer never suspecting that his favorite appetizer had been transformed into an instrument of justice. Samuel presented Dr. Ashford with his turtle soup, the physician commenting favorably on the rich broth that would be his last meal. Lucy delivered Judge Whitmore's stuffed quail with the deference expected of a young black woman serving a powerful white man. And Patience herself placed the venison medallions before Master Beaumont, looking into his eyes for just a moment as she set the plate on the table. He was discussing cotton prices with the state senator, completely absorbed in business matters, never acknowledging her presence except to nod approval at the dish's appearance. By 9 o'clock, some of the guests were beginning to show the first subtle signs of poisoning: a slight pallor, occasional touches to the stomach, requests for water to combat unexpected thirst. But these symptoms were easily attributed to rich food and strong drink, the natural consequences of elaborate dining rather than evidence of deliberate murder. Patience moved through the evening service with the calm efficiency of a woman who had found her purpose. Every dish served, every glass refilled, every need anticipated and met with the skill of decades. She was performing her final act as head cook of Magnolia Heights, and she intended to make it perfect. At 10 o'clock, Master Beaumont rose to offer a toast to the assembled company, praising their friendship and the continued prosperity of Mississippi's plantation system. The guests raised their glasses of contaminated punch, drinking deeply to celebrate their dominion over the lives and labor of others. None of them noticed Patience standing in the shadows by the kitchen door, watching as they consumed their own destruction. Her work was nearly complete, and soon the reckoning would begin in earnest. The harvest moon had risen full and bright outside the windows, bathing Magnolia Heights in silver light that would illuminate the justice she had served with her own hands. The first signs of distress appeared at 10:30, just as the gentlemen were preparing to retire to the library for cigars and brandy while the ladies withdrew to the parlor for coffee and gossip. Mrs. Crawford, the overseer's wife who had always taken particular pleasure in having enslaved women whipped for imagined infractions, suddenly pressed a hand to her stomach and excused herself from the table with uncharacteristic brevity. Patience, carrying a tray of coffee cups to the parlor, observed the woman's pale complexion and unsteady gait with professional satisfaction. The oleander was beginning its work, and Mrs. Crawford had apparently consumed enough punch to feel its effects acutely, though probably not enough to prove fatal. "Martha seems a bit under the weather," Judge Whitmore commented to his wife as they moved toward the parlor. "Perhaps the rich food disagreed with her." "I'm feeling rather queasy myself," Mrs. Whitmore replied, fanning herself with unusual vigor. "This autumn heat is quite oppressive for October." But it wasn't heat that was affecting the judge's wife, it was the poison coursing through her bloodstream, beginning the process that would either make her violently ill or kill her, depending on how much punch she had consumed during the evening's festivities. Patience moved through the rooms like a shadow, refilling coffee cups and clearing dessert plates while carefully observing the symptoms developing among the guests. State Senator Hartwell was perspiring despite the cool evening air, occasionally pressing a handkerchief to his forehead between conversations about railroad development. Mr. Davidson from the Planters Bank had developed a slight tremor in his hands that he tried to conceal by keeping them clasped behind his back. The four men who had been specially targeted were showing more pronounced effects. Crawford had excused himself twice to step outside for fresh air, his face taking on the grayish pallor that indicated his heart was beginning to struggle against the oleander's assault. Dr. Ashford was experiencing what he probably attributed to indigestion, touching his chest and throat with the unconscious gestures of a man whose body was beginning to betray him. Judge Whitmore had begun to sweat profusely, the perspiration beading on his forehead and staining his shirt collar as the poison attacked his cardiovascular system. And Master Beaumont was showing signs of confusion, losing track of conversations and occasionally staring into space as if trying to remember something important. Patients felt no satisfaction in their suffering, only a cold sense of justice being served. These men had caused immeasurable pain during their lives, treating human beings as property to be bought, sold, beaten, and worked to death. They had separated families, destroyed communities, and built their wealth on a foundation of systematic cruelty. Now they were dying as their victims had died, in pain, without dignity, and with no power to control their fate. At 11 o'clock, the first death occurred. Crawford collapsed in the library, falling forward from his chair onto the Persian carpet while discussing the merits of different cotton varieties with two neighboring planters. The other men rushed to his aid, loosening his collar and calling for Dr. Ashford, who was himself struggling with increasing symptoms of oleander poisoning. "Heart failure," Dr. Ashford pronounced after a cursory examination, his own hands shaking as he checked Crawford's pulse and found none. The excitement of the evening, combined with rich food and strong drink, these things sometimes prove too much for a man of his age. Crawford was 52 years old and had been in robust health, but Dr. Ashford's explanation satisfied the other guests, who murmured condolences and helped move the body to a guest bedroom pending arrangements with the undertaker. No one suspected murder. Sudden death from heart failure was common enough among middle-aged men who lived well and exercised little. Patients learned of Crawford's death when Thomas rushed to the kitchen with the news, his eyes wide with shock and fear. The head overseer had been a brutal man, hated by every enslaved person on the plantation, but his death still represented a dangerous disruption of the normal order. "Dr. Ashford say it was his heart," Thomas whispered. "Say the excitement just too much for him." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Patience replied calmly, continuing to wash crystal glasses as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Mr. Crawford lived a hard life. Maybe death was a mercy." But Crawford's death was only the beginning. As midnight approached, the symptoms among the other guests grew more pronounced. Mrs. Davidson fainted in the parlor and had to be revived with smelling salts. Senator Hartwell began experiencing chest pains that he attributed to indigestion but that sent visible waves of alarm across his features. Several of the younger guests, who had consumed less punch due to their preference for whiskey and wine, were experiencing only mild nausea and headaches. But the older men and women, who had praised Patience's punch recipe and returned repeatedly to the bowl throughout the evening, were clearly in distress. Dr. Ashford was fighting his own battle against the poison, trying to treat other guests while his vision blurred and his hands trembled uncontrollably. He prescribed laudanum for the stomach complaints and recommended that those feeling ill should rest quietly until the symptoms passed. Some form of collective food poisoning, he told Master Beaumont, who was himself struggling to maintain focus on the conversation. Perhaps the oysters were tainted, or the cream sauce spoiled in this unusual heat. These things happen even in the best-managed households. At 12:30, Judge Whitmore suffered a massive heart attack in the parlor, clutching his chest and gasping for air before collapsing among the horrified ladies. This time, Dr. Ashford was too ill to provide meaningful assistance, leaving the other guests to attempt crude first aid that proved utterly ineffective. The judge died within minutes, his body convulsing briefly before going still on the parlor carpet. His wife screamed and fell into hysterics, requiring the attention of two other ladies who were themselves feeling increasingly unwell. Patients moved through the evening service with the calm efficiency of a woman who had found her purpose. Every dish served, every glass refilled, every need anticipated and met with the skill of decades. She was performing her final act as head cook of Magnolia Heights, and she intended to make it perfect. At 10 o'clock, Master Beaumont rose to offer a toast to the assembled company, praising their friendship and the continued prosperity of Mississippi's plantation system. The guests raised their glasses of contaminated punch, drinking deeply to celebrate their dominion over the lives and labor of others. None of them noticed Patience standing in the shadows by the kitchen door, watching as they consumed their own destruction. Her work was nearly complete, and soon the reckoning would begin in earnest. The harvest moon had risen full and bright outside the windows, bathing Magnolia Heights in silver light that would illuminate the justice she had served with her own hands. The first signs of distress appeared at 10:30, just as the gentlemen were preparing to retire to the library for cigars and brandy while the ladies withdrew to the parlor for coffee and gossip. Mrs. Crawford, the overseer's wife who had always taken particular pleasure in having enslaved women whipped for imagined infractions, suddenly pressed a hand to her stomach and excused herself from the table with uncharacteristic brevity. Patience, carrying a tray of coffee cups to the parlor, observed the woman's pale complexion and unsteady gait with professional satisfaction. The oleander was beginning its work, and Mrs. Crawford had apparently consumed enough punch to feel its effects acutely, though probably not enough to prove fatal. "Martha seems a bit under the weather," Judge Whitmore commented to his wife as they moved toward the parlor. "Perhaps the rich food disagreed with her." "I'm feeling rather queasy myself," Mrs. Whitmore replied, fanning herself with unusual vigor. "This autumn heat is quite oppressive for October." But it wasn't heat that was affecting the judge's wife, it was the poison coursing through her bloodstream, beginning the process that would either make her violently ill or kill her, depending on how much punch she had consumed during the evening's festivities. Patience moved through the rooms like a shadow, refilling coffee cups and clearing dessert plates while carefully observing the symptoms developing among the guests. State Senator Hartwell was perspiring despite the cool evening air, occasionally pressing a handkerchief to his forehead between conversations about railroad development. Mr. Davidson from the Planters' Bank had developed a slight tremor in his hands that he tried to conceal by keeping them clasped behind his back. The four men who had been specially targeted were showing more pronounced effects. Crawford had excused himself twice to step outside for fresh air, his face taking on the grayish pallor that indicated his heart was beginning to struggle against the oleander's assault. Dr. Ashford was experiencing what he probably attributed to indigestion, touching his chest and throat with the unconscious gestures of a man whose body was beginning to betray him. Judge Whitmore had begun to sweat profusely, the perspiration beading on his forehead and staining his shirt collar as the poison attacked his cardiovascular system. And Master Beaumont was showing signs of confusion, losing track of conversations and occasionally staring into space as if trying to remember something important. Patients felt no satisfaction in their suffering, only a cold sense of justice being served. These men had caused immeasurable pain during their lives, treating human beings as property to be bought, sold, beaten, and worked to death. They had separated families, destroyed communities, and built their wealth on a foundation of systematic cruelty. Now they were dying as their victims had died, in pain, without dignity, and with no power to control their fate. At 11 o'clock, the first death occurred. Crawford collapsed in the library, falling forward from his chair onto the Persian carpet while discussing the merits of different cotton varieties with two neighboring planters. The other men rushed to his aid, loosening his collar and calling for Dr. Ashford, who was himself struggling with increasing symptoms of oleander poisoning. Heart failure, Dr. Ashford pronounced after a cursory examination, his own hands shaking as he checked Crawford's pulse and found none. The excitement of the evening, combined with rich food and strong drink, these things sometimes prove too much for a man of his age. Crawford was 52 years old and had been in robust health, but Dr. Ashford's explanation satisfied the other guests, who murmured condolences and helped move the body to a guest bedroom pending arrangements with the undertaker. No one suspected murder. Sudden death from heart failure was common enough among middle-aged men who lived well and exercised little. Patients learned of Crawford's death when Thomas rushed to the kitchen with the news, his eyes wide with shock and fear. The head overseer had been a brutal man, hated by every enslaved person on the plantation, but his death still represented a dangerous disruption of the normal order. Dr. Ashford say it was his heart, Thomas whispered. Say the excitement just too much for him. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Patience replied calmly, continuing to wash crystal glasses as if nothing unusual had occurred. Mr. Crawford lived a hard life. Maybe death was a mercy. But Crawford's death was only the beginning. As midnight approached, the symptoms among the other guests grew more pronounced. Mrs. Davidson fainted in the parlor and had to be revived with smelling salts. Senator Hartwell began experiencing chest pains that he attributed to indigestion but that sent visible waves of alarm across his features. Several of the younger guests, who had consumed less punch due to their preference for whiskey and wine, were experiencing only mild nausea and headaches. But the older men and women, who had praised Patience's punch recipe and returned repeatedly to the bowl throughout the evening, were clearly in distress. Dr. Ashford was fighting his own battle against the poison, trying to treat other guests while his vision blurred and his hands trembled uncontrollably. He prescribed laudanum for the stomach complaints and recommended that those feeling ill should rest quietly until the symptoms passed. Some form of collective food poisoning, he told Master Beaumont, who was himself struggling to maintain focus on the conversation. Perhaps the oysters were tainted, or the cream sauce spoiled in this unusual heat. These things happen even in the best-managed households. At 12:30, Judge Whitmore suffered a massive heart attack in the parlor, clutching his chest and gasping for air before collapsing among the horrified ladies. This time, Dr. Ashford was too ill to provide meaningful assistance, leaving the other guests to attempt crude first aid that proved utterly ineffective. The judge died within minutes, his body convulsing briefly before going still on the parlor carpet. His wife screamed and fell into hysterics, requiring the attention of two other ladies who were themselves feeling increasingly unwell. 2 deaths in one evening, Master Beaumont said, his words slightly slurred as the oleander affected his nervous system. This is most unusual. Perhaps we should end the gathering and allow everyone to return home. But ending the gathering was easier said than done. Several of the guests were too ill to travel, requiring bedrooms in the main house while they waited for their symptoms to subside. Others were reluctant to venture onto dark country roads when they were feeling dizzy and confused. As the night wore on, Patience moved through the chaos like an angel of death, providing water and cool cloths to the suffering while secretly observing the progress of her revenge. The poison was working exactly as she had planned. Some guests were recovering from mild doses, others were seriously ill but would likely survive, and her primary targets were dying one by one. At 1 o'clock, Dr. Ashford succumbed to the oleander that had been concentrated in his turtle soup. He died quietly in the library, slumping over in his chair while pretending to read medical journals that might explain the evening's mysterious epidemic of illness. The other guests found his body 20 minutes later, when someone noticed that he had not responded to questions about treating the ongoing medical emergency. By then, rigor mortis was already beginning to set in, confirming that the man who had conducted medical experiments on enslaved people had breathed his last. With Dr. Ashford dead, the guests were left without medical expertise to guide their response to the crisis. Panic began to set in as they realized that 3 men had now died within the space of 3 hours, and many of the survivors were experiencing symptoms that seemed to be worsening rather than improving. "We need to send for another physician," Mrs. Beaumont declared, though she was herself pale and shaking from the smaller dose of oleander she had consumed. "Something terrible is happening here, and we must have medical assistance." But the nearest physician lived in Natchez, 12 miles away over dark country roads, and none of the guests were in condition to make the journey safely. They were trapped at Magnolia Heights with their fears and their symptoms, waiting for dawn and praying that the mysterious illness would not claim more victims. Master Beaumont tried to take charge of the situation, but the poison was affecting his ability to think clearly. He wandered from room to room, issuing contradictory orders and forgetting conversations within minutes of having them. The oleander was attacking his brain as well as his heart, creating confusion and disorientation that would soon give way to convulsions and death. At 2 o'clock, Patience made her final rounds through the main house, ostensibly checking on the needs of the suffering guests but actually observing the culmination of her life's work. In the parlor, several ladies lay on sofas, moaning softly and pressing cool cloths to their foreheads. In the library, the surviving gentlemen sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend how a festive evening had transformed into a nightmare of death and disease. She found Master Beaumont in his study, slumped over his desk with his head in his hands, breathing laboriously as his heart struggled against the massive dose of oleander he had consumed with his venison medallions. "Master Beaumont," she said quietly from the doorway, "can I bring you anything?" He looked up at her with eyes that were already glazing over, his face gray and covered with perspiration. "Patience," he said, his voice barely a whisper. What is happening here?" "Justice," she replied simply. "Justice for Moses. Justice for my sons. Justice for Ruby and all the others you treated as property instead of people." Comprehension dawned slowly in Beaumont's dying eyes as he realized what she was saying. He tried to speak, perhaps to call for help or to deny her accusations, but the oleander had progressed too far. His body convulsed once, twice, and then went still. Aldrich Beaumont, master of Magnolia Heights and owner of 300 human souls, died at his desk with the ledgers of his human property spread before him like an indictment. Patience stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the man who had owned her for 26 years, who had sold her children and sentenced Ruby to sexual slavery in New Orleans. Death had taken the arrogance from his features, leaving behind only the pale, unremarkable face of a man who had lived without honor and died without dignity. She turned away and walked back to her cabin for the final time. The remaining guests would survive the night, though some would carry permanent damage from the poison they had consumed. By morning, they would summon help from Natchez and begin the process of investigating what had happened at Magnolia Heights. They would find 4 dead men and a dozen sick survivors, victims of what appeared to be a tragic case of food poisoning that had claimed some of Mississippi's most prominent citizens. But Patience would not be there to answer their questions. She sat on her narrow bed and uncorked the small vial of oleander extract that she had reserved for herself. The liquid was bitter on her tongue, but she drank it all, following it with water from the clay pitcher that had served her for so many years. Then she lay back on the rough mattress and closed her eyes, thinking of Moses and her sons, of Esther and Ruby, of all the people she had loved and lost during her years in bondage. Soon she would join Moses in whatever realm awaited those who had fought against oppression with their final breath. Outside her cabin window, the harvest moon shone down on Magnolia Heights with cold, impartial light, illuminating the end of one story and the beginning of another. Ruby and Gabriel were free, carried north on the river toward lives they could shape with their own hands. The men who had claimed to own them were dead, victims of justice served by a woman they had never bothered to see as fully human. Patience Blackwood died as the moon set on October 31, 1852, taking with her the secrets of the kitchen that had been her domain and her weapon. But her story did not end with her death. It lived on in the freedom she had purchased for 2 young people, in the fear she had planted in the hearts of those who survived, and in the knowledge that even the most powerless person could find a way to strike back against injustice. The Harvest Moon Feast would be remembered throughout Mississippi as a tragedy that claimed 4 prominent men in a single night. But for those who understood the deeper truth, it would be remembered as something else entirely, As the night, an enslaved woman became an instrument of divine justice, serving death to her oppressors with the same skill she had once used to serve their dinner. Cincinnati, Ohio, October 1855, 3 years later. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the small schoolhouse on 5th Street, illuminating the eager faces of 23 children who ranged in age from 6 to 16. Ruby Freeman, formerly Ruby of Magnolia Heights, stood at the front of the classroom, pointing to letters written on a slate board while her students practiced their pronunciation. "Remember, children," she said in the warm, patient voice that had made her beloved among Cincinnati's free Black community, "education is the key that unlocks the door to freedom. Every letter you learn, every word you read, makes you stronger and more capable of controlling your own destiny." At 19, Ruby had grown into a confident young woman who bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who had fled Mississippi 3 years earlier. Her dress was simple but well-made, sewn by her own skilled hands, and her dark hair was arranged in the neat style favored by respectable schoolteachers. But it was her eyes that showed the greatest change. They held the steady gaze of someone who had faced the worst that life could offer and emerged stronger for the experience. The children adored her, not just for her patience and kindness, but for the stories she told them about the importance of literacy. She never spoke directly about her experiences as an enslaved person. That past was too dangerous to share openly, even in free territory, but she made them understand that the ability to read and write was a precious gift that must never be taken for granted. "Miss Freeman," called 8-year-old Samuel, raising his hand with characteristic enthusiasm, "can you tell us again about the lady who taught you to read?" Ruby smiled, her heart warming as it always did when the children asked about her past. She had crafted a careful story over the years, one that honored Patience's memory while protecting the dangerous truths that could still bring harm to those who had helped her escape. "There was a wise woman on the plantation where I was born," she said, settling into the familiar rhythm of the tale. "She worked in the kitchen, and she was known throughout the county for her skill with food and healing herbs. But what made her truly special was her belief that every person, no matter what their circumstances, deserved to learn and grow." "Was she your mama?" asked little Mary, whose own mother had escaped slavery in Kentucky just 2 years earlier. "She was like a mother to me," Ruby replied, her voice soft with memory. "She taught me that knowledge is the one thing that nobody can take away from you, not even the most powerful person in the world. She used to say that as long as you could read and think and learn, you carried freedom inside your heart, no matter what chains they put on your body." The children listened with rapt attention, as they always did when she spoke of the woman who had saved her life. They didn't know that Patience Blackwood had poisoned 4 white men to secure Ruby's freedom, or that she had died by her own hand rather than face the consequences of her actions. They knew only that there had been a brave woman who had sacrificed everything to ensure that a young girl could have the chance to read and write and teach others. After the morning lesson ended, Ruby walked the few blocks to her small apartment above Miller's General Store. The space was modest but comfortable, with a sitting room that doubled as a sewing workspace, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and washstand. But it was hers, the first place she had ever lived where no one could sell her or force her to leave. She had supported herself initially through seamstress work, using the skills Patience had taught her to take in mending and alterations for Cincinnati's growing middle class. Her reputation for fine needlework had spread quickly, and within a year she had saved enough money to pay for teacher training at the Institute for Colored Youth. Now she taught school in the mornings and continued her sewing work in the afternoons, saving every penny she could toward the dream that sustained her through the darkest moments of homesickness and grief. Somewhere in the South, perhaps in the sugar fields of Louisiana, her childhood friends Marcus and Isaiah might still be alive. If they were, she intended to find them and buy their freedom, just as Patience had bought hers. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Gabriel Freeman, her adopted brother in freedom, if not in blood, standing in the hallway with a wide grin and mud on his boots. "Ruby," he called, sweeping her into an enthusiastic embrace that lifted her feet from the floor. "I just got back from Louisville, and do I have news for you?" At 20, Gabriel had grown into a tall, strong man whose work on the riverboats had given him broad shoulders and calloused hands. But his eyes still held the same quick intelligence that had impressed Patience years ago, and his smile could light up a room when he was excited about something. "Let me guess," Ruby said, laughing as he set her down. "You've been promoted to captain of your own steamboat, and you're going to be the richest riverman on the Ohio." "Better than that," Gabriel replied, pulling a letter from his jacket pocket. "I've been asking questions all up and down the river, talking to conductors on the Underground Railroad, checking with every contact I could find. And look what I got back from a friend in New Orleans." Ruby's heart stopped as she recognized the implications of what he was saying. For 3 years, she had been searching for any trace of Marcus and Isaiah Blackwood, the twin sons whom Patience had described with such love and heartbreak. The chances of finding 2 men among the thousands of enslaved people scattered across Louisiana's sugar plantations had seemed impossibly small. But Gabriel's expression suggested that impossibly small was not the same as impossible. She took the letter with trembling hands and unfolded the single sheet of rough paper. The handwriting was careful but unpracticed, suggesting someone who had learned letters as an adult. "To whoever is looking for Marcus and Isaiah, my name is Joseph, and I work at Belle Fountain Plantation outside New Orleans. There are 2 brothers here who match the description you gave. They came from Mississippi about 4 years ago, sold from a cotton plantation after their mama tried to poison some white folks at a big dinner party. The story goes that their mama was a cook who got revenge for her sons being sold, and she killed the master and some other men before taking poison herself. These boys talk about their mama all the time, how she was the head cook at a place called Magnolia Heights, how she taught them letters and numbers, how she told them stories about Africa and freedom. They say her name was Patience. If these are the ones you're looking for, they're both still alive, though the sugar work has been hard on them. Marcus lost 2 fingers to the cane mill last year, and Isaiah has scars on his back from a whipping, but they're strong men with hope still in their hearts. The master here is always short of cash, and he might sell them if the price was right. It would take maybe $1,200 each, or $2,400 for both. I know that's a lot of money, but freedom is worth any price. If you want to pursue this, you can reach me through the Methodist Church on Rampart Street in New Orleans. Ask for Reverend Williams. He's a friend to colored folk, both slave and free. May God bless your search, Joseph." Ruby sank into a chair, the letter fluttering in her shaking hands as tears streamed down her face. After 4 years of wondering, of fearing the worst, of carrying the guilt that she had escaped while Patience's sons remained in bondage, she finally had proof that Marcus and Isaiah were alive. $2,400, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "How can we possibly raise $2,400? Gabriel knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his strong grip. "The same way Aunt Patience raised the money to buy our freedom," he said firmly. $1 at a time, 1 day at a time, until we have what we need." Ruby looked at her brother, for that's what he had become, family forged in the crucible of shared experience rather than blood, and saw the same determination that had sustained them through their desperate flight from Mississippi. "How much do we have saved?" she asked. Gabriel pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket and counted the contents carefully. "Between your teaching and sewing money and my riverboat wages, we've got $347. It's not enough yet, but it's a start." Ruby wiped her eyes and stood up, feeling the familiar surge of resolve that had carried her through the most difficult moments of her life. Patience Blackwood had taught her that impossible things became possible when you were willing to sacrifice everything for the people you loved. "Then we start now," she said. "I'll take on more sewing work, teach private lessons in the evenings. You keep working the river routes, but ask around at every port, there might be others who would contribute to freeing Patience's sons. People remember her story, even if they don't know all the details." Over the following months, Ruby and Gabriel threw themselves into their mission with single-minded determination. Ruby worked 16-hour days, teaching school in the mornings, giving private literacy lessons in the afternoons, and taking in sewing work that kept her bent over her needle until well past midnight. Gabriel took on extra runs between Cincinnati and New Orleans, building a network of contacts who might help with both fundraising and logistics. They were not alone in their efforts. Word of their mission spread through Cincinnati's free black community, and donations began to trickle in from unexpected sources. The Methodist congregation where Ruby taught Sunday school took up a special collection. The Ladies' Literary Society organized a benefit auction. Even some of the white families who employed Ruby as a seamstress contributed to what they understood as a worthy cause, the reunion of a family separated by slavery. By summer of 1856, they had raised nearly $2,000, still short of their goal but close enough to begin serious negotiations. Gabriel made contact with Reverend Williams in New Orleans, who agreed to serve as an intermediary with the plantation owner. The negotiations took months, complicated by the owner's reluctance to sell two of his strongest workers and the delicate nature of conducting such business across state lines. But finally, in September of 1856, word came that a deal had been struck. The owner would accept $2,200 for both men, payable immediately, with the understanding that they would be transported to New Orleans and officially manumitted before being released. Ruby and Gabriel pooled their resources with borrowed money from friends in Cincinnati, scraped together the final amount, and sent Gabriel south with the gold and legal documents needed to complete the transaction. It was the most terrifying gamble of their lives, sending their entire fortune into the hands of strangers, with no guarantee that the deal would be honored or that Marcus and Isaiah were even still alive. 3 weeks later, Ruby was teaching her morning class when she heard commotion in the street outside. She looked through the window to see a crowd gathering around a wagon that had just pulled up in front of the school. Her heart began to race as she recognized Gabriel climbing down from the driver's seat, followed by 2 other men. The twins were painfully thin, their bodies bearing the scars of 4 years in the sugar fields, but Ruby would have known them anywhere. Marcus and Isaiah Blackwood, now 21 years old, stood blinking in the Cincinnati sunlight like men emerging from a long, dark dream. Ruby dismissed her class early and ran from the schoolhouse, her careful teacher's composure dissolving as she threw herself into the arms of the brothers she had thought she might never see again. They held each other in the middle of the street, crying and laughing and trying to speak all at once, while curious neighbors gathered to witness the reunion. "And Patience?" Isaiah asked through his tears, the first coherent words any of them managed. "Is she?" "She's gone," Ruby said softly. "But she died free, and she died knowing that we would all be together again someday. She never stopped fighting for you." Over the following days, as Marcus and Isaiah recovered their strength and began to adjust to life in free territory, Ruby told them the full story of their mother's final act. She described how Patience had planned and executed her revenge against the men who had destroyed so many lives, how she had arranged for Ruby and Gabriel's escape, and how she had chosen to die on her own terms rather than submit to punishment for her crimes. The brothers listened with a mixture of grief and pride, understanding finally why their mother had seemed so determined and purposeful during their last days at Magnolia Heights. They had grown up hearing stories of her skill and intelligence, but now they learned that she had been far more than a talented cook. She had been a strategist, a protector, and ultimately a liberator who had used her knowledge and position to strike a blow for justice. "She's saved us all," Marcus said one evening as the 4 young people sat in Ruby's small apartment, sharing stories and planning their future. "Even when we thought we were lost forever, she was still working to bring us home." Isaiah nodded, touching the scars on his back that would remind him forever of his years in the sugar fields. The overseer at Bellefontaine used to say that no nigger was smart enough to outwit white folks. I wish he could have met Mama. She was smarter than all of them put together. As autumn arrived in Cincinnati, the 4 young people who had been touched by Patience Blackwood's sacrifice began to build new lives rooted in the freedom she had purchased for them. Gabriel continued working on the riverboats, but now as a free man earning wages rather than a piece of property generating profit for someone else. Marcus found employment at a furniture factory, his skilled hands adapting quickly to woodworking after years of handling sugar cane. Isaiah joined the Underground Railroad as a conductor, using his knowledge of plantation life to help other enslaved people find their way to freedom. And Ruby continued teaching, but now with a deeper understanding of what education could mean. She had seen how knowledge could be used as a weapon against oppression, how a woman with nothing but intelligence and determination could change the course of multiple lives. She made sure her students understood that literacy was not just about reading books, It was about claiming the power to shape your own story. On October 31, 1856, the 4th anniversary of the Harvest Moon Feast, the four gathered in Ruby's apartment to remember Patience Blackwood and honor her memory. They lit a single candle and shared stories of the woman who had taught them that freedom was worth any sacrifice, that justice sometimes required terrible choices, and that love could transform even the most powerless person into an instrument of liberation. "She's still with us," Ruby said as they sat in the candlelight, thinking of the woman whose courage had made their reunion possible. "Every time we help someone learn to read, every time we assist a runaway slave, every time we choose hope over despair, we're carrying on her work." The candle burned late into the night, its flame a small beacon of remembrance for a woman who had lived as property but died as something far greater. Patience Blackwood's name would never appear in the history books that recorded the great events of her time, but her legacy lived on in the lives she had touched and the freedom she had secured for those she loved. The harvest moon rose over Cincinnati as it had over Mississippi 4 years earlier, but now it shone on 4 free people who carried with them the unbreakable spirit of a woman who had served justice with her own hands. They were living proof that even in the darkest circumstances, individual courage could light the way toward liberation, and that the bonds of love were stronger than the chains of bondage. In the end, Patience Blackwood had won the only victory that mattered. She had ensured that the people she loved would outlive their oppressors and tell their own stories in their own words. The Harvest Moon Feast had been her final gift to the future, a gesture of defiance that echoed through the years in the voices of children learning to read, former slaves finding freedom, and families reunited against impossible odds. Her story was their story now, and they would carry it forward into whatever future they chose to create with their own free hands. If these untold stories of defiance and survival stir your soul, join our community. Subscribe to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of American slavery. Your support helps us keep these powerful narratives alive.